Hi there, I am Jocelyn
Hi.
Dunn. I am a reporter for Muse TV. Would you please like to introduce yourself in the film?
Yes, I'm Birgitte Stærmose. I'm a Danish filmmaker. I live in Copenhagen, and I'm the director and writer of the film AFTERWAR.
Thank you. Um, well, this movie is very evocative, and while a film could really focus on the thoughts and perspectives of adults who can elaborate on their viewpoints amongst famine and diaspora, cultural identity, even. You, however, choose to capture the perspectives of the Kosovo War from children, and their viewpoints are no less complex than that of adults. So, can you elaborate on the stages of the interviews and auditions, and the important elements and distinctions that you sought from the stories of the children that we follow?
I mean, the film consists of a short film that I did in 2008, and then it's become a longer film by following the same characters for 15 years until they're adults. So I mean, I didn't, the process was over a long period of time with the children where we would meet them and talk to them and interview them. I did these long audio interviews that were the same questions for all of them. They weren't particularly individualized. They weren't very private. They were more like questions like, what's your fear in life, or what do you hope for? What's your dream? What do what do you eat for dinner? So a mixture. They were actually sort of loosely based on these Proust questions that have been very popularized by the Actors Studio, or Vanity Fair, and so I used those kind of almost generic questions because I wanted to get to sort of a more abstraction and more existentialism, and I didn't want it to be about them individually.
Mm.
So it's very intentionally a collective story, so in the short, when they're children, in the beginning of the film, they speak each other's stories. I purposely switched the stories around, so it's not necessarily their story, but it's their collective story. So throughout the film, it's about that. And the short film I think it has actually 11 children. Then when I went back to do the longer film, if you do a feature film and you have it in 3 time periods, with 11 characters, it's virtually impossible to put that story together so it's watchable. So I decided to focus on 4 main characters in the adult part. Um, and the way I chose them was partly sort of their interest. Is based on who was interested in putting in the work and who was less interested in putting in the work. I didn't deselect somebody who wanted to be in the film. It was more organic than that.
Isha të lujtë në livall, bari ishte I gjatë. Atëheri kom pa qenë të rrugës, të ngaj të le. Motra jam, të lujtë me ta të ndjek. Qentë. Sa një fundit që ka bo, është me lujtë me ta. Pastaj brit me nonës tem, si ojka. Qysh mund është me harruat njërë. Krejt e kena historinë e njëjtë. Mas lufte, burrat janë ma të heshtën. S'po do më shumë. Avdën I këriga? S'ka me po gabimin e njëjtë unë, shka po vajan. S'kam qef, kaj, usja natë, para gjumit, qashtu qysh më kajke, nala. Ti po menën që lufta u kry. E unë veç për pres më kry që ke pas lufta.
I mean, this is a narrative film, right? So that it can be mistaken for a documentary, and you yourself are not a documentarian.
Yeah.
And similarly, we follow youth that have endured a real war, and they themselves are not actors with any formal training by any means. And so each character breaks the fourth wall to evoke, introspection and even empathy rather than pity from the audience, to consider how their words can conjure memories of or connection, not just to the Kosovo War, but to really any war in particular.
Yes.
So, how many stages did the script enter to balance your own creative integrity, consultation, and then the real stories from the youth that you interviewed?
I mean, I never had an intention for the scripts not to be controversial in terms of their perspective. Like it's always been an effort to really try to understand on a deeper level what was their situation. So there was never any conflict between what I wanted to tell and what they wanted to tell, because I didn't have an agenda that wasn't the same as theirs. I'm a fiction director, and it could be mistaken as a documentary. Many people call it a documentary, and I don't stop them necessarily. They're allowed, though I would prefer to call it a film. And because I think it does live somewhere in between the two. It's an effort to really heighten reality. So it's kind of taking reality, but enlarging it for the audience through the use of fiction. And in terms of performing, like if you spend enough time and if you have the patience, I think I could make most people perform. And the closer the performance is to their real emotions, where real acting comes in is when you have to perform something that's really far from you, but they have to perform themselves. They don't have to perform anything but themselves. So they really just have to take their own emotions and their own experience and their own beings into a performative space. And that's different from an actor taking, using their tools and their talent to go into a space that's actually foreign to them. A lot of performance, there's a lot of work with actors around that process of going into a space of a lived experience that's not theirs. Actors can't live every character's experience. It's impossible, and they shouldn't. So a lot of tools that you use when you work with professional actors is tools to be able to make a truthful performance for an experience that they never lived. But in this film, they are only performing their own lived experience. So as long as you are able, and in some instances it took time or it was difficult, like I know Sheva said to me recently when we talked, she said, look, sometimes it was really hard because I had to step into a space that was painful in my past, and I'm really glad I did it and I really wanted to do it, but it sometimes took a little time to sort of move out of that again, because we did go into some past traumatic experiences that they had, but we also, gave voice to it, so they, when I met them in 2017, again, when we sort of formalized to start to film again, and they were adults, they were in a situation, one of the first things I discovered was that they were in a situation where when she says in the film, I don't talk to my mother, I don't talk to my friends about what I went through as a child. That's true. That's true, actually, up until the film was screened. So they were living a life where this had become silenced. Nobody, because it was connected to shame and trauma, and nobody wanted to talk about it. It was too painful. I fully get why. And so when we, the crew came back and met with them, we were actually people who were willing to talk about it. We knew what had happened because we had filmed it. They knew that we knew. So we were witnesses and we were comfortable talking to them about it. So I think there's been a process that I can see now. I wasn't so aware when we were doing it because we were just in the midst of it. But now I can see there's been a process where they have been able to step out of this taboo and the silencing of their experience. And not only have they talked to us about it or we filmed it, but they have also now met huge audiences that have witnessed it. And, you know, when they came to Denmark for the cinema release, they, you know, I said, you know, we talked about a little bit what happened in Berlin when we had the premiere, and two of the boys said, you know, they're like, you know, people came up and hugged us after the film, you know, so it's just, you know, there was just so much warmth to them standing there after the film from the audience that they could feel, and also a lot of dignity. And I think, you know, they have lacked dignity, you know, that's something they've lacked. And I actually can see now, and I don't want to sort of glorify the process or the filmmaking or anything, but I can now, when I look back, I can see that there's actually been a process that I hadn't foreseen of them. It's almost like they're taller every time, you know, they have sort of, you know, they have really, I think, gained. And I, you know, you couldn't be sure. Like, I was concerned, you know, when we had the premiere in Berlin, you know, like, they had never been to the cinema. Two of them hadn't been on an airplane, you know, two of them hadn't been to another country but Kosovo. So, you know, sort of flying to Berlin, staying in a hotel, meeting, you know, 500 people at a premiere where you see yourself huge on screen can be truly shocking, you know. And I of course, talked to them about it and tried to prepare them. But, you know, the truth is you can't really prepare people for that because you don't know, you know, it still can be shocking, you know, it can be shocking to your vanity, it can be shocking, you know, in many ways. So I was definitely, you know, tried to prepare as much as I could, but also was like, wow, I hope this is going to go well, you know. And I think, you know, I was just sort of really so pleasantly surprised at that experience, and also their ability to stand after the film and really speak for themselves. You know, I think there's just a step out of the taboo and the silencing into speaking about it that has happened sort of alongside the film.
Thank you. That actually brings about my next question. I mean, this film exhibits what the field of psychology calls a longitudinal study.
Yeah.
And the past segment of the film, you know, as you describe, is much of the short film that you did nearly 20 years ago, which was, as you said, certainly not intended to be a feature.
Right.
And we follow the same youth 15 years later in the present segment. So you stayed in contact with the youth as they grew up. And so what sparked the curiosity to extend the short into a feature? And then did any of the subjects experience, or the characters, if you will, experience any apprehension about revisiting their lives on the screen, especially those from the short, you know, especially those from the short who didn't want to be in the feature, and as adults who can now voice their thoughts, you know, and more articulately than they were as youth?
Yeah.
Did they uphold any boundaries, or did they participate any more, you know, more collaboratively with the story making of the script and the edit?
My curiosity to extend it came from, you know, we had connection during the years in different ways. I had with some had with people from the crew in Kosovo, you know, some people, you know, or most of them I would follow on social media, you know, and I was sort of very curious, you know, I could see certain things happening, you know, like one person was all of a sudden in Cologne. I was like, how did he get to Cologne? You know, like, you can't get out, you know. And, you know, I could see the religion growing, you know, which wasn't very prominent when they were children, you know. So I could just see different things that were happening, and I got very curious. And I also could see that they was continuing to struggle, and it just made me think about, you know, like, the way we tell stories on film. You know, we like to have a problem, and we also like to solve it within the storytelling. And when I looked at their lives, I thought, this is not actually solved, you know, and it's not clear that it will be solved. So I really wanted to try and tell a story about that, you know. And of course, some people say, oh, you know, it just seems like it goes on and on, but that's actually the reality. You know, like, the reality is, if you're stuck in an economic disadvantaged situation, it's really difficult to get out, you know. And I actually think we do people in those situations, we do them a lot of disservice by continuing to tell, this pulling yourself up by the bootstraps mentality. I think is not helpful. It's actually, it's mean, and I think we have to recognize how difficult it is to change your destiny. And so I saw an opportunity, besides being very fascinated by seeing people age on screen, like in Boyhood. I think it's very beautiful what you can, tell when you pull, I just love seeing films where and it's so rare because it doesn't, how do you do it? It's so rare to see that. And I also thought, wow, it would be very compelling to see them go from children to adults and actually witness the struggle that as it continues. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to sort of do like an anti-Hollywood narration about what it means to struggle, just like, with war, we also have this narrative which says, we have a very, in the news, we have these dramatic stories about war, and there's misery, and there's people are killed, and blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden there's nothing, and it's as if it's solved. And then we ignore that it's not solved, and I think, and of course it's much more exciting to tell stories that way, but it's you leave people behind in that way of telling stories.
That actually brings about my next question. Feels very symbiotic here. Because, you're absolutely right. In narrative film and even literature, war is glamorized. And it's often presented as gratuitously horrific and violent, and presenting many nameless casualties in mass. And moreover, as a society, we're fixated on that. We become desensitized, and we have this emotional affect by the grim numbers, and we're just as helpless in just accepting that.
Yeah.
We even see that in the horror genre and video games, where we don't even see the social and emotional ramifications of that. And instead of choosing to show the horrors, you fictionalize elements and present very real stories through oral history. And these children, like I said, are the relics, and they're the generational key to preventing history from repeating itself. So, and you also go into some of the, just the critical response, and having the characters from the film actually being presented into society and garnering such accolades. So, given that AFTERWAR has been the recipient of several prestigious honors, does it feel conflicting to garner praise for what is objectively very tragic? And do the subjects or characters feel affirmed and see any material or meaningful change in their personal lives from these accolades, despite having endured so much loss?
I mean, I think, it would be for them to answer that question truthfully, because I don't want to, I have a sense of what the answer is, but I think it's for them to answer it. I mean, if I have to answer it, which I do because you're talking to me, I would say, like I said before, I can observe a strength that they have gained from going out with the film, a strength from stepping out of the taboo, feeling the dignity of having the story told. And I think, what Shiva usually says, if people ask her, why did he do the film? And she says, she says, I do it because I don't want other children to suffer the way I did. That's her answer. And I think that tells you a couple of things. One important thing it tells you is that, if you have gone through struggle yourself, like in this case as children, and as adults, your empathy becomes really great. They're hugely empathetic people. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but I do think, there's a purpose for them to feel like they've done something for this not to happen to other people. There's a point to that for them. The accolades are theirs just as much as they're mine. So I don't have they are co-creators, and it's their film, just like it's mine. So they take as much, as much sort of glory out of that as I do, maybe even more, because they're not as jaded as I am. For them it's new to have some accolades like that.
There's quite a balance between static moments and movement in their monologues that at the same time, with in tandem with B-roll, it actually offers the audience a sight of location.
Mm-hmm.
And it establishes that. So were there any location restrictions? And additionally, when scouting and working with your cinematographer, your director of photography, Mark Weiss, did any of the locations spark any cultural significance, and that you're perhaps walking on some grounds or steps that were distally or distantly crumbled grounds?
From old grounds? What do you mean by that?
Sites of destruction or that had been
Sites of
affected by war?
No. I mean, you mean like, did we film places where there had been destruction during the war, for example?
Yes.
Yeah, not so much. I mean, there's a scene that is significant, I think, for people in Kosovo that might understand where we are, where he cuts the fish.
Mhm.
I think on top of the hill behind him, there was a Serbian general who sort of sat up there, who had some kind of post up there, which was quite gruesome. It's a bit of an interior, it's a local feeling. I mean, I think in terms of the locations, we use the locations, maybe, the film is about emotion, the emotionality of the characters more than anything else. So, and in that way, we also use the locations, I would say. The locations carry certain emotions and certain feelings, so we have the tunnel that we use again and again, which has a certain feeling. They walk in it as children, they walk in it as adults. Then there is, behind the film, but both in the sound actually and in the images, there is this feeling of a world that's starting to grow, but doesn't include them. This feeling of development and prosperity sort of as a backdrop that they clearly are not part of, because they remain in the same locations that they were, which is the truth again of their lives, is that they have not, been able to live the same prosperity as other parts of the society have.
We open the movie seeing animals scavenging for food. The same could be said for the youth who we follow, for reasons outside of their control, have been placed in a primitive state of deprivation and survival that mimics predator-prey relations in nature's, ecological hierarchy, whether by selling peanuts for €1, cutting a fish with bare hands, or drinking milk from a cow that's just moments from being assassinated. This movie is both culturally specific enough that we follow youth after the Kosovo War, but also broad enough that we can draw elements from these stories that are universal, of survival. So there's this circularity of life here. When you destroy something, often what is destroyed and what the debris makes the ground much more prosperous for life to grow there. In following these youth for years, what is something that you as a director are able to take away from kind of seeing this part of yourself in the project as a whole going out into the world, and instead of being jaded, as you said, they're not jaded, actually changing the world?
I do hope that people will start to have a greater awareness of sort of these long-term consequences of war, and I do hope that people will start to think a little more about their position in relationship to people who suffer. Like they talk about it in the film, and I do hope that we can get a little more complex about that. you know, because I think it is complex. And I think this, you know, I mean, the film, you mentioned pity earlier, but, you know, it's been very important for me in the film not to make a film where you could just sit and feel pity for these characters, because of course they deserve that we feel sorry. But I think this emoting sorriness is actually useless. You know, it might be good for yourself to feel sorry because then you feel like you've done something. But I think for the world, it's actually a little problematic if that's what we mainly do. You know, if our role is mainly to feel something on behalf of other people, and it became very apparent to me very early in the process, because I had been to Kosovo and I had interviewed the children. I would come home and try to process. It was harsh to hear what they had to say. And I would start to tell family and friends about what they had told me. And I found that people would quite quickly, you know, almost cut me off and say, hey, you know, I feel really bad. Feel so sorry for them, you know, expressing all this pity. And once they had done that, sort of gone through a little thing of that, then they would switch the topic and actually just talk about what are we going to have for dinner kind of thing. And it just, because I'd just been with the kids, I thought, what do they care? They do not care. You can feel sorry or you can feel happy. You know, it's your business. You know, like you don't think you're doing anything by feeling sorry for them. They don't actually want you to feel sorry for them. I mean, if you want to do something for them, you can help them, you know, like they would be like, well, you could give me €1, you know, like, you know, they wouldn't be like, oh, feel sorry for me. I mean, who wants anybody to feel sorry for them? And I think in this pity game that we do in order to get through it, you know, I actually respect that people can have a need to feel pity because it's a way of getting past it and actually feel like you've dealt with it. But I think we have to be very clear in our minds about that it's just something about yourself. It's not about the other people. And there's even an uncomfortable hierarchy in it, because all of a sudden you have a hierarchy of those who can feel pity and those who could be pitied upon. And that hierarchy I'm not comfortable with. So I actually, you know, and I think in filmmaking, we can be very guilty of this pity game. You know, we make a film about somebody, you know, it's really sad and we can weep over it. And then we feel really good because we had some catharsis by being sad about something, you know. And I think, you know, there's a lot going on in the world right now where I observe, you know, like it's a really fine line between being engaged and just being engaged in how you feel. You know, and if you're just engaged with how you feel, it's just a self-absorbed thing. You know, if you don't put it into any kind of action, but you're just going around feeling something, I would say do something more useful. You know, do something else. You know, like do something else with your life. You know, don't waste your time going around feeling sorry for other people, because they don't need it and they don't actually care. You know, like, I mean, if I walk on this, I'm in New York and there's, you know, there's a homeless person lying on every pavement on every corner, right? If I, you know, went around and a tear was rolling down my cheek every time I saw one, would that make a difference? No. It would, you know, it would make no difference for them. They're still lying there, you know, like, you know, it's a sort of a simplified version of that. And I think it's just, I think we should stop it once and for all and just try to think a little more about, like, what can I actually do something, you know, like, can I actually change anything? You know, is there anything I could do that could change this situation for these people? And focus on that a little more than all our emotions.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I know it's a lot to engage with this very difficult subject matter, but I do appreciate it. And thank you again for your patience. I hope that the press circuit goes very well for AFTERWAR, the movie.
Yeah, I really enjoyed our conversation. Your questions were great, even when they threw me off.
I appreciate that.
It's because they were complex. So thank you. Thank you.
Have a delightful day.